Welcome to part 2 of our film screening and roundtable of Caché. Before we get started, just a couple of little pieces of housekeeping. The images you see on the walls are part of a new exhibition called The Philipson Bible and Freud's Imagination. And this is an exhibition that's coinciding with a roundtable that will be held on November 15th, which is called Freud, Psychoanalysis, and the Philipson Bible. This exhibition was curated by Andrew Raftery, who's Associate Professor of Printmaking at the Rhode Island School of Design. So I want to thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's roundtable. Brigitte Peucker is joining us a second time. She moderated a roundtable that we had about a year ago for a screening of Fassbinder's In a Year with 13 Moons. She is the Elias Leavenworth Professor of Germanic Languages and Literatures and Professor of Film Studies at Yale University. Her books include Lyric Descent in the German Romantic Tradition, Incorporating Images, Film, and the Rival Arts, and The Material Image, Art and the Real in Film. She's currently... Are you still working on a book on Fassbinder?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And she's going to introduce...
Project. Not finished yet.
Okay. Let us know when you're done. She'll introduce the rest of the panelists. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here again to speak with people about film. Before I introduce my colleagues, I should just say that sharp intake of breath that everyone, or so many people, took during the very violent episode of the film, that this is the kind of effect that this filmmaker, Michael Haneke, is well known for setting up. And there is this affective dimension to his films that I'm sure that someone will talk about. But it's my pleasure to have friends and colleagues here. This is, to my left is Roy Grundman, who is an associate professor of film studies at BU, where he also heads the film program. He has worked on Andy Warhol. One of his books is on Andy Warhol. He's currently writing a book on Michael Haneke. But last year, he also curated a major retrospective of Haneke's films here at MoMA and also at two museums, the MFA in Boston, and got to know the director that way. And he is writing a book on Haneke, have I said that, and also editing the Blackwell's companion to Haneke. So he's quite well informed on this project and on this filmmaker and many others. And then to his left is Garrett Stewart, who is the James O. Freeman Professor of Letters at the University of Iowa. He is the author of many books and articles on Victorian fiction, and most recently has written books on film and painting. His latest book, Framing Time, contains a section on Haneke that's really very interesting. And I don't know whether you will be participating, but everyone, are you participating in the panel? Because it would be great. No. Brian Price, who is an assistant professor of film studies at Oklahoma State. And he's currently editing an anthology of essays on Haneke as well. His book on Robert Bresson is coming out in the spring, I think, with Minnesota Press. And it's interesting that Haneke claims Bresson as one of his models, great influence on him. And Brian has also co-edited some anthologies, one, the BFI book on color, and and then this other project that will come out soon too, this collection of essays on Haneke. And everyone knows Ed Nersessian, who's of course co-director of the center. So Roy has kindly agreed to say a few words about Hanukkah in general that can start off a discussion, and then we will all chime in and narrow the focus a bit.
First of all, thank you so much, Brigitte, for inviting me. Thank you to the Society for having me and for hosting this roundtable. It's interesting to come back to New York to see Caché and talk about it, because Caché was the occasion for me to make contact with Mr. Haneke at the screening of the film at the 2005 New York Film Festival. The project that we started at that point was a collaboration between Boston University, the Goethe Institute Boston, and the French Consulate Boston. And we filed a grant to get money from the European Union to subtitle Haneke's early films, which had never been shown in this country. His career, in some ways, to just be very brief, falls into two very broad periods. One is his made-for-television period from the early 70s to the late 80s. And the second one is the theatrical feature film period, which began in the late 80s and continues to the present. And within those, there are certainly, subdivisions possible. But we were able to, we became aware of his early work, the television films, and we were able to get money from the European Union to subtitle most of these films, 7 out of 9, and include them in this comprehensive retrospective, which was the first one in the English-speaking world. And that came to MoMA last year in October, and Haneke came, and then he also traveled to Boston, and we had him there in two venues, as Brigitte was saying, at the Harvard Film Archive and the Museum of Fine Arts. And he taught a master class for us, and I got to spend a week with him and his wife. And that was very exciting. And then we had a 3-day conference on his work as well, which is now being edited into a book. But it's interesting to see Caché again, because for me, just seeing it again now, it's one of the one of the most complex Haneke films. There's an incredible formal complexity to the film, as I think everyone probably gauged in some form or other. Haneke always makes us discover new things and also question our experiences with the image, question what we had just seen. And maybe if you've seen the film before, you immediately start seeing other things that you hadn't seen the first time. There's also a lot in Caché that is in other Haneke films. People have certainly pointed out that there is a strong connection to an earlier film called Benny's Video, which also has to do with tapes, with the rewinding of these tapes. It has to do with generational strife between the parents and their son. That's one of the classic Haneke topics. But of course, what's interesting about Caché, in addition to these aspects, is that there is the element of an ethnic other, an element of of people who are not white European, white French citizens, and this became a relatively recent concern of Haneke's. And just the last point I wanted to make in this opening is to just say that an interesting thing about the release of Caché was that it was released in France the same month that the race riots in the Paris banlieues, the Paris suburbs started. So there is a poignancy to this film in quite a few ways. So shall we?
Which direction to go in? It's interesting the way in which the political is so often articulated within the context of the family for Haneke. That holds true of other films as well. 81 Fragments. It holds true for Code Inconnu. and various other films. It always seems that no matter how much his purview is broadened to include socio-political strife, and one sees that so often on the TV monitors, the televisions that are constantly running in the apartments of those who are characters in his films. But no matter what, it always comes down to, or is allegorized, the conflict is allegorized through the nuclear family. And a nuclear family of a particular kind, there's usually a class dimension as well. It's in this film, of course, they're called bobos. In other films, Funny Games, for instance, it would be the same class. In Austria, the rather, upper middle, affluent people of education. And these various scenarios that we actually find in this film play themselves out time and again in that psycho-socio context. But I don't want to, sort of deflect from the political concerns here, just to say that, again, it's anchored in the question of adoption also, which is interesting from a political perspective as well. I don't know if somebody wants to jump in here or go in another direction.
I mean, I would follow from that and say that I think that I agree that I think that Haneke is in many ways one of the most interesting and important thinkers of the political in film, but in every walk of thought. And one of the ways that I see it is not only the family, but also an interest in the ways in which, our vision is situated in political terms. In other words, that this film asks a lot of questions about what we see and how we see, and we all notice very different things. And I think part of what we notice in this film has to do with what we're expecting to see. So, for instance, Roy was saying, as we were talking earlier before the film, that he, at the last shot of the film, where you see the two sons together, the New York Times had fooled him and told him to look to the left side of the corner, but I think you said you noticed the car instead of the kids. And I think that's emblematic of the ways in which of something important about vision, which is to say that I think Haneke, I would suggest, is really interested in problematizing this idea that we can just look at something and understand it simply by looking at it, because what we already think and what we already believe will impact how we see and what we think about what we see. And I think that's Georges' problem in some sense, right? It's what drives him, this trauma. So I think, and I think that can be understood politically, certainly around the October massacre that is referred to as well, which perhaps we can talk about.
I'm curious how many people did see the two boys talking together, because not everyone does when they or how many did not notice, did not notice that the Algerian son and Piero were.
It was during the credit sequence?
At the end, just before the credits.
Just before they begin. Yes. The credits run over that image.
During the credits.
Just before,
just before
during.
the credits.
Just before and during. Well, the image is there.
Right.
The camera is held on the scene of the school, and the two boys meet and talk just before the credits run. But the camera continues to be held in that placement through the running of the credits. And things happen, people move. It's not a still image, right?
Can't hear you. I thought I saw them come together at the end of the credits, but maybe not.
No.
They were there the whole time.
Well, it's very interesting that we are not quite certain, and usually what we would do in this case is, go back to the DVD and replay it, much as is going on here. But I know you were going to say something, Garrett.
Well, I was initially curious about whether that is legible, that conversation, and then what it means to those who did see it. I mean, it's completely ambiguous, especially because we begin that scene immediately following the nightmare, presumably, that he's having, the memory or nightmare that George is having after his 2 sleeping pills of the result of his lies, the taking away of the son. So that scene is followed by another scene which could be read as part of his dream. Since it isn't a surveillance camera, we presume. To me, it's as if the sins of the father are being visited on him in the next generation, and that the boys will know.
That's actually been remarked upon, the vexing disconnectedness of that last long scene from the rest of the film. I mean, not only could it be a part of George's dream, it could also, it's not clear temporally where the scene is actually positioned. Could be the last scene of the film, the way we see it as the last scene. But it could also be, in terms of the narrative, it could well be what this film starts with, as a narrative, as a story.
That's right.
It's a big sort of vexing thing that Haneke attaches to that.
In which case, the suspicion I once heard voiced by a friend that Perrault must have put the tape inside the door that George stumbles on when he looks out into the street and doesn't notice until he's come back in. It would be, in other words, that the kids are in it from the beginning to get even.
Although they're quite convincing when they, or at least Majid's son is quite convincing when he claims to know nothing.
That's very convincing, isn't he?
And everyone is very convincing when he or she claims to know nothing. The only person who always lies very ineptly is Georges throughout the film.
And I noticed this time he's lying right at the end to her.
Yes.
He cannot
Even
tell the
at the
truth.
end. Yes,
He's
no
saying,
matter
look
what.
at the blood, that must have been a weird forewarning of what he would do to himself. And 2 seconds later, he's told the guilty secret about the rooster. He just constitutionally cannot get the truth out.
If the last scene is confusing temporally, but also the nature of the image, the first one is confusing also, because I don't think I was able to hear this, but when I've watched it on a DVD, I used to think that the film began with a still image, just like Hitchcock's Rear Window, from which it takes the whole metaphor of surveillance. That's the sort of master text of surveillance. And I thought it began in a still image and then actually became animated. But you can still ask yourself whether it's still and animated. But when you hear it better, if you're watching it at home, let's say, and can turn up the volume, you hear the twittering of birds. So even for those, 2.5 minutes long, even for those, let's say, first 2 minutes, when there isn't any motion whatsoever, the idea is, or at least sound suggests, but again, we can't be certain, sound suggests that this is a filmic image. But even there's that uncertainty about the register of the image, which is sort of part of what is going on in this movie.
I'm so glad you said that, because you couldn't hear them this time.
No.
And I've double-checked to make sure that same thing. So they're the same birds that are in the nightmare at the end, conceivably. Before you hear the chickens.
Yes.
Well, that's certainly one of the interesting things about a lot of Haneke films, and especially in this film, is you have you get to the point where you basically question the identity or the status of every single one of the images that are put in front of you. You know, you don't know if it's one of those tapes until it is rewound. And then at some point you start expecting, when you have a certain camera angle, this to be the tape, another tape, and then in the notorious suicide scene, that is actually then not borne out, for example. You know, we don't know that this is a tape. I mean, it looks like, structurally speaking, I would say it's not.
That's interesting.
You know?
What about the fact that I mean, this can happen with a film camera, obviously, but what about the fact that that Georges moves out of the frame? You know, the camera holds, and Georges moves out of the frame, which to me was the sort of indicator of its being a static, fixed surveillance camera, or you know, something like that, possibly not actually a real camera, which is sort of what I think.
In the suicide scene,
yeah.
you mean? I think that's possible, absolutely. The only thing that we don't get is another scene in which that gets played back as a tape,
right.
you know, which is a big irony, because that's the moment when, in terms of the narrative, he would have liked to have proof that it wasn't he who killed Brigitte, and that's what's withdrawn from him at that point.
Yeah.
It's denied.
That's
I think that and also what you're saying points to. I think the film is really skeptical about vision, and so the difficulty of even making that distinction, because to want to make the distinction of whether this is video, whether this is Hanukkah's camera, whether this is somebody else's camera, whether it's video, whether it's film, he's constantly frustrating all of our efforts to try to make sense and to make these very certain distinctions. So even this question about medium specificity is a lure of some sort, because he's always everything we can convince ourselves of a lot of different scenarios of what happened, and so much of it has to do with which images we put together and the concepts we use to organize those clusters, let's say.
This is the second time I saw this film. The first time, and I think it's good to see it a second time, because the first time I saw it, we had rented the DVD, I don't know, from Netflix or wherever, and there was a description of it. And so I was expecting to see some kind of mystery movie that would have a Hitchcockian type of movie. And there are many Hitchcockian elements here. But when you see it the second time and you are not, your mind isn't set towards thinking you are going to have a puzzle here that you're going to solve, and you are going to figure out from all the clues what's happening and how they fall in together. When you don't have that anymore watching it the second time, because you know you're going to be frustrated, you see a lot of other things in here, which I think to me the significant ones are, one, that it's a lot about the construction of reality, and how reality is so much a question of one's own perception, not only visual perception, but psychological perception and evaluation of the situation. And whether that perception is affected by what is implied in here, which is guilt about some crime that was felt to have been committed as a child, or whether the perception is determined by just the visual nature of the incongruities. The second thing struck me also was that it was also underscoring the fact that the cohesiveness of a narrative does not mean that the narrative is truthful. That you can have a very cohesive the scene, for example, when the fellow is talking about the old woman that invited him to her table, and talks about the dog, and now he says, well, the dog was this, at this date it happened, and so on. And for a little moment, with our tendency to want to believe in magic and the unreal, everybody gets carried away, and it's very coherent. It happened this way, it happened that way, it happened. And then he breaks it, he blows it up in order to show that, there is the cohesiveness, the coherence doesn't have anything to do with what the reality is. And the other thing I noticed is about making assumptions. In the scene where he's with his mother, he's making assumptions about her, and he says, when you are alone, isn't it terrible to be alone in your house, not to be able? And the mother contradicts every one of his assumptions, because that's not how she felt. And we always make assumptions about situations and other people and think that they're accurate. and most of the time they are not. And so in that sense, a lot of this, what I saw today, is very akin to what we see and do in psychoanalysis, which is we don't take the surface as real. And we are always looking for what is hidden, because the discovery of the hidden is what really gives you control over the surface.
It's interesting, too, that the cohesion in every instance of this film is also related to violence, which I take to be related to the problems of the appearance of truth in a narrative, right? That it's violent in some way. And I think that this is a point that Haneke makes a lot in 71 Fragments, and especially a film that insists on putting blank spaces between images to in some sense, make us aware always of the way in which we're constructing these stories in an effort to prove what we think is real and what's true.
And also I think because violence and anxiety are a lot more powerful than other things, by generating anxiety, by creating a fear in the man, he is then able to show that you can make this man do all sorts of crazy things. He's lying to everybody, to his wife, to everyone, to himself. But it's because of the fear that is now intense in him due to what he assumes is his childhood bad behavior.
That makes the story about the reincarnated dog even more interesting, not just a model for our willingness to invest in a coherent narrative, but it's a parable of the return of the past in a new form.
Actually, we're going to hold questions until later. So
There are, maybe I'll just speculate a little bit about, and raise questions that I have too about how to read the film, because of course one does struggle to read the film. And it's true that we can't attach the camera really, I think that the film doesn't let us attach the surveillance camera to any person in the narrative. It suggests in that brief scene at the end that we've just been discussing that there might be some kind of, in fact, the two sons know one another. And I do think that rather than attaching to the conspiracy narrative, that attaches to, this is how I read it, to the political narrative. And I actually see that as a more utopian moment in which, although the nature of their actions might cast doubt on that, but in which it might be possible to imagine that the sons of this older generation could be friends, could interact in positive ways. So I don't read that final scene, and you've already mentioned that we don't even know when it happened, but I don't actually read that in connection with the cruel voyeurism or the suffering child who resurfaces in other Haneke films. And I actually think that the reason the film prevents us in formal ways from coming to conclusions about who done it, it's not, we can't figure it out, Ed has just said, is that, but here I want to give it another sort of, I dare not say psychoanalytic, but let me just say sort of psychological reading, because in other films, violence has been perpetrated. In other films by Haneke, violence is perpetrated by parents and children, really mainly children, against the parents by way of a video. I won't even go into the details because it's just plot details. And there is always a child who's also made to suffer. In that same film, a little girl is killed. And constantly in Haneke films, there is a kind of dialectic or a kind of tension between a sadistic cold gaze, which is the gaze of surveillance here, but also has a lot to do with the surface of the film. It's very cold. And, you know, there are these moments of intense affect. And so someone who causes suffering and someone who suffers. And there is a film that came before this one called Time of the Wolf, whose narrative involves a group of people of many different nationalities in a country that isn't named. We don't know where it is or what it is. We know some disaster has occurred, but we don't know if it's ecological. We don't know what has happened. And there is a strong, cruel presence. And also I should add that Haneke made a film about Kafka's The Castle, in which that cold paternal gaze is given a political reading as well. But anyway, you have this cold gaze, this paternal gaze, and you have the frightened child, the wounded child. And I just want to, I guess, sort of throw out the idea that these are disembodied. They're no longer really figured in the characters, or they are, but the fact that they're figured in the narrative isn't the point, really. It's the interrelatedness, the interconnection of these two figures. And I actually locate them both in, and I'm constantly giving films auteurist readings, and I know there are many among my friends who probably frown on that, but I read this as some kind of dynamic that just, you know, inhabits his films, that actually produces his films. The cold, manipulative director, but I don't want to call it the director figure, call it the gaze, and then the child, who actually is, in some sense, a version of the director as child. In a way, you can see this played out in the narrative of the film as well. Anyway, I just thought I'd throw this out because it seems a great venue for doing so. Someone might be able to help me out in this.
I don't know anything about Haneke's.
Well,
Does anybody know? I mean, when we did Fassbinder, the subject was Fassbinder rather than a movie, so there was a lot about Fassbinder that was helpful to know.
Right. Well, I mean, I think there's a reason for that, for the difference between how the two are being approached, and that's a very, I think, straightforward answer. Is that Fassbinder became known within 3-4 years of the beginning of his filmmaking career. He became known in the United States and was from the beginning a very open book. People wrote about him extensively. The academic criticism that soon kicked in immediately started to do the work that Brigitte was referencing, which is something that academic criticism does. You know, used to do even more, but still does today. With Haneke, you have a bizarre situation. Here's someone who is now approaching 70, and he's been making films since the early 1970s, and he didn't even make films that were seen by international film festival audiences until 1989, and really Caché, which came out in 2005, was maybe the second of Haneke's films that had a broader reception in the United States. So that's the difference. You know, it's sort of like Haneke, the unknown, is coming at us at this point, and unlike other directors, his personal life hasn't really been worked into his narratives, which is also something that he personally doesn't have a problem with. You know, he doesn't think, he would say it's completely irrelevant. You know.
But you don't have to locate it in the biography, nor do you have to locate it in the narrative. If we take just one image in the film, which occurs in variations, and that's the tape, the videotape that's wrapped in First, a drawing of a child that's a crayon drawing with poster paint blood. Secondly, a magic marker line drawing with poster paint blood. Thirdly, an image taken from a newspaper, an image with Georges' photographs with poster paint blood. And then, is there a fourth? Yeah, the chicken. I missed the chicken. Okay, so we have in this image, or the rooster actually, to be perfectly accurate, the way in which the tape, which is the product of surveillance, is wrapped in what appears to be something made by a child. Figures together, brings together these two aspects of the dynamic. But I don't want.
No, I think you're right. I think it speaks to several levels of Hanneke's concerns. One is with the immediate film. I'm with you there, Brigitte. I think that there's we're getting strong hints that the idea of the child as someone who has something to do with this and surveillance is definitely a part. And that does go back to some of his other films where we have issues of, especially again in Benny's Video. I mean, this film is called Benny's Video. So Benny is the boy, so about Pierrot's age, maybe a little bit older, but not significantly. So you have parallels there. But I think in a larger sense, a lot of the concerns of Hanneke's films, even some of the made-for-TV films, have been that society suffers from one of society's greatest acts of irresponsibility is to not bestow a more ethical upbringing on the children. And I don't want to say a more substantial or solid education, because that seems to be what the children are getting. You see the high schools. That final scene is also a Hanneke staple. There are numerous Hanneke films that have frontal shots of high schools, and these high schools oftentimes have names, but in some films the names are no longer intact. The letters have crumbled or are missing, and so you have another metaphor for one of his central concerns, which is that it's because of the way in which children are mistreated by society, misunderstood. Society exacerbates and perpetuates a lot of the problems that he talks about. Now, I say this with a little bit of unease because I sound like some kind of sociology textbook, and that's one of the problems with Hanneke, that you end up receiving this like you would from the New York Times op-ed page, that our education is going down the tubes and there's this big generation conflict, and of course that sounds very trite. We've had this since the 1950s, so I don't think that Hanneke is even so much interested in that as a social problem, but it's a way of getting into his films, of understanding.
You don't mean it in a psychoanalytic sense of children have a lot of intense impulses of aggression and violence and curiosity. You don't mean it in that sense.
No, because I don't think he's so interested in. He would say, if I were concerned with that, I would have become a child psychologist. I wouldn't make films for people. I mean, he's an artist. He uses that as an issue to, I think, talk about larger things. For example, the production of images, which is what we always circle back to, is the production of images.
Well, that I would actually say, I think your point is not an instance of facile sociology at all, because I think that the thing that Hanneke's films provoke so easily in people is to just blame the behavior of children and adolescents on the image, right? That's the easiest thing that one can say about the image in popular culture, is that it produces violence. And I think the challenge of Hanneke's work is that he really wants to separate these things. He's really not blaming. The image is benign in Hanneke, I think. He's not really or at least it's strictly relational, and so it's not always going to be benign, but nothing's a given about an image. Whereas I think you're right, that there is something, if there is a problem with youth, he's not locating it in the realm of the image, even though he's always making films about violence, children, and images. So I think it's quite complex, actually, what you're saying.
He also actually locates, especially I'm thinking of Benny's video, he locates the problem in the absent mother. So there's a kind of conservative, a strongly conservative streak that seems to suggest that, if the mother didn't work, things would be better for the child, which, one doesn't always want to hear. But Garrett, I know you must want to talk about the nature of the image, because that's what you've written about it.
First, I want to pursue your interesting idea about the figure of the child as organizing those drawings, which aren't imitation child work on the part of the tape sender necessarily. We can't be sure, but just evoke that earlier expression of a child, and as the tape leads him back to it. This time around, I realized how precipitous the mother is in defending herself against the love triangle, when all Perrault is really saying is ask Pierre, his namesake, who knows everything. And she flies off the handle and says, what makes you suspect this? What makes you think this? There's a kind of, the Oedipal drama is for her rather than necessarily for Perrault, who may have another agenda, though I think it's right not to be too conspiratorial about that. So I wondered what you thought of that scene. As the wounded child.
Very subjective. I did not think that the mother was having an affair, but that's because I really think everybody is, in a way, being straight, other than Georges. I mean, sort of speaking the truth, or seeming genuine. The child, I found it odd that the mother would have to say at that moment that she loved the child, as though she hadn't been saying it so frequently. And it's interesting that Georges, in the last phone call, I think, says to her, "Je t'aime," in a moment when you think, is he going to commit suicide? He's taking pills. What's going on here? So I think I'm more. I thought that it was another red herring to kind of throw us off. Is the child? It wasn't clear to me that the child thought that the mother was having an affair, either that possibly the child has been up to something. He isn't around. What is he doing? Well, maybe he's collaborating on this videotape project, and maybe he isn't. Probably he isn't, but we'll never know what he was doing. But I'm not convinced by that as the wounded child. I mean, the wounded child for me here is Brigitte, as a child, very clearly, but maybe also the perpetrator of his pain, maybe also Georges. It was interesting to me that you called it a dream sequence, and it has to be given the way the narrative is configured, but the moment when the camera is located in a dark space in presumably the barn, and we see in long shot Brigitte being taken away, presumably to the orphanage. The configuration of that shot is absolutely typical of Haneke, the shooting out of a dark space into a light one. It suggests, a kind of voyeurism, and in Benny's video, that's the moment when Benny is actually taping his parents, who are talking about how to get rid of the body of the little girl he killed. He tapes his parents, he takes the tape to the police, thereby not exonerating himself, implicating himself, confessing his guilt, but implicating his parents in the plot as accessories to murder. So it's at that characteristic shot out of the darkness into the light, that where we don't see Georges at all. We only have the camera placement. And so that's very puzzling because all along perhaps we've been thinking the camera placement has nothing to do with Georges, but maybe it's another figuration of that adult presence. I don't know.
No, I
I'm
think
going to
that-
stop.
I think finally George is seeing himself from the point of view of this, seeing the world from the point of view of the surveillance camera. He's internalized it. And I call it a dream only because that same shot from the back of the barn has been
Yes.
the anchoring shot of his nightmare earlier when Brigitte comes at him with the hatchet. But I also like the idea that the last two scenes of the film are the two scenes that precede the whole event, that this is the real past when the boy was taken away, followed by the two children's collusion. Or the two children's rapprochement, at least, which would be the utopian version. So I'm intrigued by that.
But none of these things have, there's no internal verification of any of these fabrications.
Can't do it.
And, and what do people make of this motivation for this so-called crime, that a 6-year-old, wants to get rid of another 6-year-old, and that's the motivation for this person's
Suicide?
suicide? Is that plausible? It doesn't seem psychologically plausible to me.
Doesn't to me either, but
I mean, there are a lot of, I'll tell you, my two experiences of the film are of, the anxiety and the awe that comes with the formal coherence of the film, and a frustration with the psychological narrative, which has, you don't know who done it, whether there's an actual crime, whether there's a motive, and none of these things are coherent, and I wonder whether the director actually cares about them. And that's, so it adds a level of frustration. You can be impressed with your own filmic, cinematic experience of the anxiety that's created, but is the director even in control of the material that he's chosen?
well, exactly. But he may not care. He may be both and. He doesn't care and he cares deeply, and it's sort of these patterns keep reemerging. But they're not really even, figurations of the director or as a person, no, but they're sort of different personae that are kicking around in there. Yeah.
Yeah,
You cannot ask questions from there. Once you want the audience to participate, they will have to walk to the microphones.
they have to come to the microphone.
Are you ready to ask?
Yeah.
It's up to you.
Well,
whatever,
sure.
Okay, so then,
I have a number of comments, so I'm going to be quick. In response to you,
no,
there's an
first you
old
have to
adage-
say who you are.
Bruce Scleroux. There's an old adage, when you put the dagger into your belly, who do you really want to put the dagger into? So it was his rage at having his life ruined and being investigated by the police that determined killing himself in a way to try to demonstrate the rage that he really had towards George.
Well, that's certainly,
Yeah, that's one element.
but
Yeah.
you don't have this association, so you can't.
No, I'm just saying it's an adage.
Calls George.
Wait.
In terms of two, okay, sorry. We brought up dream at the end, but this film, all film can be thought of as a presentation of a dream. In the film work, like dream work, films are, as we know, are shot in little segments and they're put together in a parallel of secondary revision. Well, there are films that are even more dreamlike than this one, but in terms of so many factors, the ambiguity, what is the construction of reality, and the questionable narrative, what comes before, what comes after. I think this film. One way of getting away from an obsessive worry of, was this before, was this there, where was the camera, the spectatorship, all of which are extremely important. The spectatorship aspects are so complex here. But just to start thinking of it as a dream that doesn't have the complete coherence of secondary revision. It's a little bit like Bertolucci's The Conformist, Before the Rain, Chez Andalou more so, Mulholland Drive. Many of these films where you can't make a complete narrative. And just from a clinical point, I think you could have an interesting discussion of the superego of George. It was certainly deficient. He has some sociopathic tendencies, but what I heard in the 6-year-old incident was a projective identification. He wanted to kill, to get rid of this boy. So instead he set him up and he was and he became the recipient of killing the rooster. So he was defeated. So in his lying, in many ways, it was, there were certainly superego deficits. On the other hand, if this was George's dream, then at least we see that he was punishing himself in the fear of losing his boy in that disappearance. And the last point is, the question of the affair is, she reacted, I think, assuming there was no affair, her reaction was because she had some libidinal attachment. She must have had some fantasies about him, and she was guilty about the fantasies. So I think that would explain some of the abruptness. And the boy was picking up not just that, he was picking up this immense attention in his family that he, knew about a little bit, but he was terribly disturbed about this, and this was his way of saying, hey, something's going on here that isn't being solved. My parents aren't taking care of me.
Or you got a videotape.
Yes.
I started out watching the film. Well, how are they going to find out who's doing this? But as it went on, George, I said, the way George was acting in terms of his half-brother, in terms of and the way he acted towards people, that's what I became interested in. The ethical, as you called it, the moral thing. And after a while, with all the things he was doing, this threatening and this getting the Algerians arrested, I said he has to kill himself. That's what makes this film so great. That it wasn't an average movie where some monster or somebody gets him, but what he had done at the beginning, he became so brutal that he actually was willing, symbolically or otherwise, symbolically I guess, to actually use a hatchet to kill whomever. That's what it really turned out to be. And what made it so powerful for me was the political factor that was involved. You had all these, and he knew it, the director knew it.
Yeah.
Of course he knew it, because you saw the rebellion taking place and what has happened to, what was happening in France, what was happening with the Algerians, and so that not only did he kill, he actually killed his half-brother. He killed himself.
You mean George, right?
Yes, George.
Yeah.
Yes, George. It was really about George. These other things were, that's right. It was thrown in there about the mother. It wasn't necessary. And it really didn't explain the son, because there was nothing before that to show that that was the reason why the son was doing what he's doing. Good art, you have to prepare for things. And he did, and that wasn't prepared for. But what made this film, in my opinion, so good was the moral aspect of it, whether he's trying to do it or not, and I can't think that this director would not know that.
Okay, next one.
Hi.
Thank you.
I'm Jean Golden, and I agree with everyone. It was hard to figure out the fantasy versus the reality of this film. But one of the thoughts I had was that George was dissociated. There was a split-off part of himself, which was, possibly going on to set himself up with whatever these other materials were, because of was a projection of his guilty conscience. And so there was like a poetic justice to this film, which in a way can be very satisfying. But on the other hand, his adopted brother maybe was really guilty too, in terms of the envy that he had towards him and the hatred he had towards him because of being persecuted by him and set up by him. And maybe he was doing some of these things with the tapes and so forth. And then in the end, he feels so guilty about his destructive impulses that he destroys himself. So they end up each destroying themselves, because in the end they both cannot tolerate their acts. Okay.
That's interesting. Majid, this relates to what two of you were saying. At that moment, Majid has called. This is a moment when there really was a phone call. And he really has called Georges to ask him to come and witness his masochistic performance. You know, it's punishment of Georges. He says, I wanted you to come and see this, and slits his throat. So these other phone calls, you know, some voice, or, you know, they're not even real phone calls, but here the film tells us, or at least it suggests, that this is the case. So it is an extreme hostility that he, not only self-hatred, but towards Georges, who will be the witness of that horrible moment. Sorry.
I was looking at the nuclear family and seeing that George is hosting an intellectual show. The wife is dealing with press parties of intellectual people. They're really connected, and they love each other, and it's a very surface kind of thing. This boy is being ignored but loved, concerned but not overly so, until the mother brings that child and she says, "Where were you?" And the woman says she doesn't know why she's so upset. She just didn't make the phone call. Her being upset about the child not calling is very different from George's fear about what happened to this kid. Mm-hmm. She's getting it secondhand because he's lying to her. She doesn't have the depth. She's just totally mixed up because he's not talking to her and so on. But I'm thinking here, George was an only child. This adoption only came about because the guilt of the parents when they were taken away and killed by the French, and maybe they were thrown in the Seine. And he talks about having to share. I mean, we saw the kind of house he had. What the sharing was. When she forces him to say, "What happened? You have to tell me what happened." And he still lies, and he's giving it to her in bits and pieces. And finally he said, I said he coughed up blood, but then they brought the doctor, but he was an old doctor. But I told him, my father said that the rooster was cranky and he wanted him removed, and he gets the kid to kill him. He lies to him. That malevolence in this child is something that's very hard to deal with, especially with all this blood. Okay, now, the child is an only child as well. When he confronts the mother, and as you said, the name was Pierre, it was the same name, we don't know. The audience doesn't know. Just when you're reading a mystery, the reader knows something that the characters don't know. We don't know if that kid got a tape of that scene with her crying with Pierre and his consoling her and kissing. We don't know because he's very uptight. He won't talk to her. She's defending herself. And then when George finally tells her what he did, and she says, over a 6-year-old kid chopping, is that what it was like? I have been reading some of the greatest Dostoevsky. That's what you're telling me? That it was almost like she was cold about his turmoil, his secret, his lie. She didn't go with it. She didn't give him what he needed. I think he took those pills to space out because he really needed it, and maybe it was a nightmare when he gets back to the last scene, I don't know. But I think we have to think about what kind of wife he had in that
scene. Would you think that, I think that Majid continues to have, to see the mother. And that when the mother I think the mother pretends not to, yes, because he says at that other point, your mother is sick. Mm-hmm. Yeah, right. Or something. The actual son, the biological son, didn't know. So.
I'm Helen Getteman, and I have been doing some work over the past few years on surveillance stalking. And this is the third time I've seen this film, and the first time that I have heard experts on film talk about it. I've been doing this in isolation with my TV set and the DVD and the remote. What I am particularly interested in was your connection between the cruel gaze, the surveillance camera, and the director's camera. My interest in particular is the parallels between the director's camera and the way the cameras of surveillance stalkers are working. Just let me say, just to end it here, my particular interest as a psychoanalyst is on the connection between surveillance stalking, voyeurism, and the primal scene. And I think this film had all of the elements and would be very interested in hearing this from the film critic's point of view. Thank you.
Could you share a little of that with us first, your ideas first about this? Because I think we'd all be interested in.
Well, I got interested in the topic first with sexual stalking, and I've actually studied 5 films in some depth, have clips to illustrate my ideas. It started with Eastwood's play Misty for Me, and then Fatal Attractions, which are the 2 classic sexual stalking. Then surveillance stalking, I started with Coppola's The Conversation with Gene Hackman, who is a very schizoid. This is real surveillance stalking, but he's a paid private investigator, also very influenced by The Rear Window. And then I just recently got into The Lives of Others, where there is literal surveillance of the primal scene, trying to get evidence for political purposes, so that the political social dimension has entered into my interests as well. And then I ended up, Caché is going to be the 6th. The 5th one is a Scottish film called Red Road. I don't know if you know it, but it's about Scottish surveillance of high crime terrorist areas in I think it's in Edinburgh. And we have a real coalescence there between the sexual stalking, because the woman who does the surveillance work eventually goes out and stalks her the man that she is preying on. It's a complicated plot. But that just kind of summarizes how I came there and the interest in some of the work I've been doing.
Thank you.
All right,
Well, to answer your question, I think you're right to put the 2 together, the gaze of the camera and the surveillance gaze, because I think there are a number of ways of answering it, but one thing I would point to is that Haneke, like a lot of European directors, not only knows the history of European cinema writ large really well, but he also really knows the critical discourses about cinema. And one of the most enduring myths about cinema, European cinema, Italian neo-realist cinema in particular, that comes out of a figure, André Bazin, and who writes about cinema and privileges the long take and situates it in this period of production, Italian neorealism in the post-war period, in which this idea that Italian neorealist directors simply opened up the camera and filmed the world as it is, and we're supposed to be able to scan the image freely to see what we want to see, and thus we have a better access to truth, as opposed to films that are edited very quickly, very rapidly around in a more montage style. Now, I say it's an enduring myth because, those of us who look at Italian neorealist cinema also know that most of these films really, there are some long takes, but nothing like what one is led to believe exists there. And so I think for Haneke, there's a skepticism about the length of a shot and how long and what you'll be able to see based on the duration of a shot from a continuous point of view. And I think he's relating that to surveillance because, of course, I can imagine that in thinking about surveillance, the idea, of course, is that the camera records everything, but who has the time to look at all of it? And so there is, something's going. Even if the body is there, right? The evidence is there. How many hours of footage can you sit through?
I did find myself only crediting as surveillance things that were one camera take. Anytime it shifted to another camera, I thought, okay, well, now we're in fiction world.
Yeah.
So I think you make, maybe unconsciously, make a distinction between what you believe and what you're not, based on these same camera angles that you're talking about.
Yeah, sure.
There's, of course, film theory has talked about the idea of film as us watching films and thereby replicating the child watching the primal scene and being, not invited to it, obviously, and so the voyeurism in watching, the voyeurism of the cinema, or the conditions of spectatorship in the cinema, are sort of a secondary replication of precisely what you're talking about. I mean, that is especially in the 1970s and 80s, that was a very big concern of film theory.
Well, I think I have a related comment that leads into a question, which is, and I'm Megan Sutherland. We've talked a lot about various subjects within the film and what their motives might be and whether they might have been responsible or why for the surveillance. But I wonder to what extent we might also think about just not the question not having to do with a subject, but with the subject, and the subject being history, and how that relates to the allegorical dimension and political dimension of the film. If this is an allegory where the parent and the family expands out to concern French and Algerian relations, let's say, an allegory is a dislocative structure that's constantly moving between these two registers of individual affective motivations and then constructing some kind of rationalized narrative of some larger scenario. So I wonder if it's a no-done-it and not a who-done-it, and there is no author of the surveillance. It's simply what is, consciously admitted by the historical record or language or representation, and how we might think of it in relation to those kinds of ideas. I wondered if the panel could talk some more about that dimension of the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly one of the things that I wanted to bring up earlier already in response to a question is, the question that I think that your comment also is a great response to was the question of what we see. Does it all add up? Is there a final sort of like root cause? Is there a solution to a key to opening, Caché and understanding it? And I think that what you're saying is in many ways very productive as a response, because I would also say there isn't, but there are textual systems in this film that are put there and that sort of originate in other areas. One textual system would be Hanneke's body of work that we can use as an explanation. More particular examples, Benny's video, which has come up a lot. Another one is history itself. There is, the French-Algerian conflict, which hasn't been talked about. And then Hanneke does, I think, or the film, let's say the film, makes these intertwine. They're intertwined in the film, so that you have a level of a family conflict, you have a level of a broader historical conflict, and there is a genius in the way that, in the way in which the film makes both of these constantly reverberate, in its own structure. And I think what's interesting about Caché is that that's also, I think, where one has possibly reason to also level a certain amount of criticism against the film, because in a way, to sort of put it bluntly, we have a film in which you have someone, a white European director indicting indirectly or directly indicting the treatment of Arabs and the way in which people like Brigitte have really very limited possibilities to defend themselves, and also have a history on their side that is a history of oppression. they've been oppressed. And you know, as a quick aside, for me, that's what makes the suicide plausible, and at the same time also very problematic. It makes it plausible because this was the last time that Majid spent in a paddy wagon being carted off to the police, and he would have no more in his life of that. And yet, on the other hand, this is also another example where we need an Arab character like Majid to point the finger at ourselves. And we take this character and kill him. So we have another Arab character who's being killed by us. So that's where you have, you know, where you have history not only being indicted by the film or brought into the film as a textual system and indicted, but where you have history also replicating itself in some ways, you know. And to be very provocative, you could say that it extends to us talking about it, you know, in this roundtable, which is not perhaps so far removed from George's TV show. So, you know, and that's sort of in response to what you're saying as where do these different systems, you know, come and how do they act?
You know, he's also, I'm sorry, I think that Haneke is also identifying himself with a really unfortunate moment in the history of French cinema and French culture, you know, which said that between 54 and 62, when the Algerian Revolution was happening, images of torture in Algeria were banned in France, so it was impossible to see images. And so there's always this, and this really comes through in the French New Wave, this really celebrated moment of French film culture that's always celebrated for its political radicality, but it's actually quite conservative in its way because it doesn't, it can't even find ways. There are a few, Agnes Varda can do it. There are a number of people who can point indirectly to something that's going on in Algeria, but they can't speak about it directly. Haneke, of course, could. He's not under the same constraints as French filmmakers were between 54 and 62. But it seems important somehow that he's identifying negatively with this tradition. And also, just as a little fact, when Caché was released, or right around the same time, then all of a sudden there was a, I don't want to say a wave, but there was a small group of documentaries that were shown on French television that for the first time really dealt with the subject more explicitly. You know.
That's the defense against your own charge of scapegoating an Algerian yet again, because at least this time we will see it.
I mean, the thing is, I would say, you know, this argument has been made by a very prominent post-colonial critic, Paul Gilroy, in a British publication. And my response to it is that he's right, but he's also wrong. You know, I feel that he's right that it has to be pointed out that we have sort of a perpetuation of history. But there's also the point where you have to ask yourself, so what does that really mean for us? What is it that we're supposed to do or supposed to do differently? What is Haneke as a European filmmaker? You know, what are his alternatives? Is he supposed to not have Majid in the film at all? Is he supposed to make films about, you know, not about a conflict such as this one? Are we supposed to not talk about this? You know, I mean, there's a way in which that's also kind of in and of itself, a circuitous charge.
Gilroy's charge is even more extreme because he says that the whole thing is reduced to just the shock value on a bourgeois nuclear family.
That's, you know.
Where else should it be filmed? It's like complaining that Heart of Darkness is narrated to three rich company men on board the Yawl. Those are the people that need the story.
Right.
Two more quick comments. George, of course, is also working with tapes, editing tapes. And I'm not sure I got this right. I haven't seen the film before. But did he cut to the homosexuality? He wanted to delete some. And then the next scene, I think, was a cutting to homosexuality. This is a wild, wild speculation. But somehow that phrase makes me wonder if there was some homosexual play among the boys. That got George guilty and tempted to go more, which could be another motive for wanting to get rid of him. On the theme of voyeurism, Helen's list, of course, there's Peeping Tom, in which a photographer has a knife and kills the women during the process of photographing them. And then Kieslowski's Decalogue 6, which came out as a short film about love, which is a reversal of the voyeurism. And I think I mentioned this here a month ago. Bertolucci, who's had a lot of analysis, says that when he looks through the viewfinder on the set, he's looking for his primal scene, literally. And one thing that struck me was there was no hint of a primal scene of anything sexual in the videoing. And to me, that was a big omission, again, that you have to wonder about. I don't know what it means.
I'd like just to say,
Sure.
I think once you start making psychoanalytic speculations, there is no limit.
Right.
And anything goes, and as long as it's just saying, we can say anything about it. So I think we should hold ourselves be a little bit more careful in terms of making psychoanalytic speculations, because everything will end up being primal sin, Oedipal complex, anal conflicts, you name it. And it's one of the problems in a way with applied analysis is that you are applying analytic ideas to situations where your data is extremely inadequate. So that would be my response to the primal sin issue. Though, just to say something about that, I mean, if you wanted to read into it, well, she's sitting there putting her head on the shoulder of this Pierre because she's very upset. And if somebody saw them together with her doing that, you would say, well, maybe they're having an affair.
Could I just quickly comment on Peeping Tom? I think that actually is a central film for Hanukkah. And in fact, I've written about that in my essay for these two anthologies. But that really provides us with the figure that attaches the father to the son. Because there it's the psychotic filmmaker who, acting the role of the father, who was a psychologist who filmed his every move as a child, acting the part of the father, he uses a camera that has a projectile, a spear, to kill a victim who is always female, with whom he also identifies. So you have that doubleness of it's the child really in Peeping Tom, although it's given the woman, and there probably is some homosexual reading that one could give it. But I think that's the key figure of the way that the father and the camera attaches to the figure of the child, the wounded child in Hanukkah's film. I think that's the Peeping Tom is really the key to that.
Identification with the aggressor.
Yes.
No, well, both, the victim and the aggressor.
My name is Isaac Schlechter. I just would like to get a comment about the person killing himself in front of George, if that was considered more like a punishment or an act of guilt. Or I was going to ask you before you make the comment about the psychoanalytic theory.
I can make psychoanalytic speculations as well as anybody else. I just hold it back. But I have no idea, frankly, I have no idea what that shocking scene was about. I have no idea. I don't know what the director was thinking when he put that there. And I don't know how I can fit it into some kind of, and I noticed that people have had a tendency in their comments and questions to try repeatedly to impose meaning to various aspects of what happened. It may be that the director didn't really want any of those meanings, but wanted, in fact, as somebody said, no meaning, but rather bringing to your attention issues of incongruity and those kinds of tensions that I mentioned early on. I think, this is my personal opinion, and I certainly am, my expertise in movies is -0. But if you want to make a political movie, you can certainly do a lot better than this movie. If you want to make a movie about the Algerians and the French, you can do 1,000 times better. If you want to make a psychoanalytic movie about guilt, you can also do a lot better. So I think the way I understood it, he was doing something beyond those, and I think in that sense he did a good job.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't know, are we really talking just about randomness in movie making? I mean, we have to presume he had some idea, right? Some theme that unified his creation, no?
Well, what I thought, he was trying to point out that we construct reality the way we want it. And the way to show that was to show how the ways we construct reality keeps failing. It keeps failing in this movie. Nothing really, at the end, nothing comes together. You can force on it the notion that the two boys, one of whom seems like 18 years old and the other is 12, somehow got together and plotted this whole thing about, which seems unlikely.
Okay, I know. I was struck by a couple of things. One, the relationship between this movie and Funny Games, where Funny Games also is a subversive movie. In a way, you have these kids who come into this very wonderful upper-class gated kind of community and wreak havoc on the whole community. And it seems to me, and you never know why they do it either. And so it seems to me there's some kind of, I don't know what the author wants to say about it, but certainly it's subversive. It has to do with breaking order. And in the same way, I'm also struck with the total absence of the father in this movie. And I mean, you know that the father has to be important. He sent them off to die in Paris, and the kid kills the rooster. I mean, I think that's an important thing. So somewhere, I think I think it's interesting to think about the filmmakers' feeling about structures and the destruction of structures, and I think we're led to think about fathers just as we see people.
I want to answer something that just came up when you said something about the two boys. In the very dramatic scene when he comes back to Majid after getting a phone call, and he's agitated, and he says, "Come in, I want you to sit down." He said, "I'm not going to sit down," and he's very agitated, and Majid has this all planned out. Now, we don't know whether there was a camera there the first time when George went there the first time. When he threatens him, he says, "Are you threatening me?" He says, "I'm threatening him." That's the film that got to the station, okay, to the television station. We don't know if there's a camera set up, and he says, "I want you to be present when I do this." And it's done incredibly well and so shocking. Then we have all that time when we don't know where he is, and he won't even tell his wife. I think he went to the movies. He was walking around. He was, "Where were you?" I ran away. Now, the next key scene is when the boy, the son, goes to the television station and tries to talk to him, and he doesn't, "I don't have time," slips in the elevator. When he gets up and they have the confrontation in the men's room, it's so brilliant that I just realized that as you said something about the two sons. He's got the cool of Obama. I mean, the kid is great, okay? And he says, he's talking to him, and George is getting more agitated because he's got to get on the air, and he doesn't want to have this scene, and he doesn't want anyone to hear, and there's all of this tension. And then he says to him, "Cut the polite crap." And he says to him, "I didn't grow up in an orphanage where they teach you to hate. I had an education." So what he's saying is, I'm authentic. You may not recognize this, but I'm 18 in a different place from where you were with my father. And those two kids are the two kids of the next generation that have to try to, I mean, this is the little window or the wedge or the wrinkle that's left in there, I think. But I didn't think of it till you mentioned the two boys in that scene.
My name is Herman. I would like to emphasize in something that I think was the writer or the filmmaker was very successful, is in some way was mentioned already, is the perception. I think there are very contrasting situations of perception. First, the psychophysical perception handled by the movie techniques. The perception of the socio-political perception more than the political perception, and also the family perception, the parental perception of the situation. I think that was very interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think we're going to, that's it. Thank you for your participation.
Further information about our programs and a complete archive of past Philip Tades events is available at philiptades.org.